Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of Comms 246. Today, we're going to talk about verbal and nonverbal communication and culture. This week's reading includes Chapter 7, Verbal Communication and Culture, and Chapter 8, Nonverbal Communication and Culture. We'll start with Chapter 7. The learning objectives for Chapter 7 include describing the components and characteristics of language, explaining how language shapes our thoughts and behavior, analyzing communication styles and gender differences in verbal communication, and appreciating the relationship between language and identity. For Chapter 8, we'll cover the characteristics of nonverbal communication, the functions of nonverbal communication, the different types of nonverbal codes and their application, and finally, the influence of culture on nonverbal communication. Chapter 7 concentrates on the relationship between language and culture. It describes the components and characteristics of language, explains how language shapes our thoughts and behavior, and discusses the relationship between language and reality through the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic relativity. Through analyzing communication styles across cultures, the chapter draws your attention to the differences in gender communication, as well as the relationship between language and identity. This chapter provides you with an in-depth understanding of the integral relationship between language and culture. First, we'll start by defining verbal communication. Verbal codes consist of a set of rules governing the use of words in creating a message, along with the words themselves. So verbal codes refer to spoken or written language. As we grow up, we learn the rules governing our mother tongue so that we can use the language effectively to express our thoughts, emotions, desires, and needs. Different languages have different rules for ordering words to produce meaning. Lustig and Kester identified 5 interrelated components of language. Those 5 components are phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. Phonology deals with the organization of sounds in a given language, so it explores how sounds are organized. And the phonological rules of a language determine how sounds are combined to form words. Morphology refers to the combination of basic units of meaning, morphemes, to create words. These morphemes differ across cultures. Semantics refers to the study of the meaning of words and the relationship between words and their reference. Meaning often resides in a context, so linguists identified 2 types of meaning, a denotative meaning and a connotative meaning. So a denotative meaning is that dictionary definition, and a connotative meaning is the meaning that we ascribe to a word. Syntax is the study of grammatical and structural rules of language. This varies across languages, and each language has its own set of formal grammatical rules. Pragmatics is concerned with the impact of language on human perception and behaviors, and it focuses on how language is used in a social context. Although languages differ, there are some characteristics shared by all languages. Newlip identified 5 characteristics shared among all languages. All languages have, first, a way of naming objects, places, or things, a way of naming action, a way of stating the negative, constructing interrogatives, and differentiating between singular and plural nouns. A systematic set of sounds combined with a set of rules for the sole purpose of creating meaning and communicating, with no natural or inherent relationship between the sounds and their accompanying alphabet. And finally, a set of formal grammatical rules for combining the sounds and sequencing words to create meaning. The language that we speak affects how we see things around us, how we think, and how we act in the world, as well as how we want to be seen by others based on what we say and what we do. Noam Chomsky claimed that all human languages share a universal grammar, the basic parameters of which are innate to all humans. It's thus only the details of a particular language which are learned. Nativists claim that the fundamental syntax for all languages is universal, and that the particular languages are simply dialects of the human universal language. This is what Noam Chomsky called the universal grammar. Grounded in the work of Piaget, constructivists oppose this idea and argue that language acquisition involves unveiling the patterns of language and require active interaction with a structured environment. So there is kind of an academic dialogue between the nativist and constructivist view. There's also philosophical debates surrounding the extent to which our perception is shaped by the particular language that we speak. Nominalists argue that our perception of the external reality is not shaped by language, but by material reality. Any thought can be expressed in any language and can convey the same meaning. Relativists, on the other hand, believe that our language determines our ideas, thought patterns, and our perceptions of reality. This relationship forms the crux of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which proposes that language and thought are so tied together that a person's language determines the categories of thought open to the person. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis does not imply that people of one culture cannot think of objects for which another culture has a plentiful vocabulary, but that the distinctions that vocabulary permits are reflective of that culture's values. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has two versions: strong or linguistic determinism, which posits that language that one speaks determines one's perceptions of reality, or the weak version, which is called linguistic relativity, which makes the claim that native language exerts an influence over one's perception of reality. This slide illustrates the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis using a Chinese example, so you can look over this. Okay. As we acquire our native language, we also learn a set of culturally appropriate rules regarding our verbal communication. Communication style refers to how language is used to communicate meaning. Goody-Kunst and Ting Toomey identified 4 communication styles: a direct or indirect communication style, elaborate and succinct, personal and contextual, or instrumental and effective. But rather than viewing yourself as being either direct or indirect, you should view these communication styles as on a continuum. So a communication style is how a language is used, or how language is used to convey meaning to others. So first, an indirect or direct communication style. That is how one explicitly or implicitly communicates their desires, wants, intentions, or needs. So a direct communication style is one in which the speaker's needs, wants, desires, and intentions are explicitly communicated. On the other hand, an indirect communication style is one in which the speaker's true intention or needs are implied or hinted at during the communication. So in a few weeks, we'll talk about collectivism and individualism. Indirect communication style is mostly seen in collectivistic cultures, whereas direct is mostly seen in individualistic cultures. Elaborate and succinct communication style can be understood on the same continuum. This dimension is concerned with the quantity of talk a culture values and reflects a culture's attitude toward talk and silence. The elaborate style involves the use of rich, expressive, and embellished language in everyday conversation. In succinct communication style, simple assertions and even silence are valued. The personal and contextual style is concerned with the extent to which the speaker emphasizes the self as opposed to their role. The personal style amplifies the individual identity of the speaker and is often used in individualistic cultures. The contextual style emphasizes status and role and formality and power distance. Therefore, it's often seen in collectivistic cultures, which highlight one's roles and identity and status. Finally, we'll look at the affective and instrumental communication style. An instrumental style is goal-oriented, sender-focused, and communication is used to achieve an outcome. The affective style is receiver-focused, process-oriented, and the affective speaker is more concerned with the process of communication than the outcome. This chapter helps us appreciate the relationship between language and identity. Research shows that language is a vital aspect of our identity. An identity based on ethnic language also hinges on the assumption that one's linguistic community is acceptable in a number of ways. To understand this, we need to understand ethno-linguistic vitality, which is the degree of prestige, acceptability, and importance attached to a group's language. The language or dialect that we speak influences the way that we're perceived by others. The dialect, regional accent, or language that a person speaks influences social attitudes toward a speaker. So we all need to think about the accent or dialect or languages that we speak. Even if you think that you don't have an accent, if you speak in a quote-unquote Midwestern accent, you may not think that you have an accent, but we all have accents and there are social attitudes linked with those accents. And there's some accents in the United States that we place higher value towards and some that we place lower value towards. And that's all tied up in ethno-linguistic vitality. So chapter 7 discusses language, verbal language to be specific, and how that communicates meaning. The language that we speak influences how we perceive and categorize the world around us. In chapter 8, we were introduced to nonverbal communication. This chapter focuses on nonverbal communication and the influence on intercultural communication. This chapter defines nonverbal communication, identifies similarities and differences between verbal and nonverbal codes, and explains the characteristics and functions of nonverbal codes. The term nonverbal communication refers to the use of non-spoken symbols which communicate a specific message. Nonverbal communication includes the use of space, body language, the use of touch, paralanguage, time, smell, appearance, and even the way that you dress. Research has shown that there's a degree of universality among some nonverbal communication. However, scholars believe that the rules governing the appropriate use of nonverbal codes varies across cultures and are imparted to a culture's members through socialization. Verbal and nonverbal communication often take place simultaneously. The verbal message conveys the literal or cognitive content of a message, whereas the nonverbal component of the message communicates the affective or emotional content. The affective content accounts for much of the meaning we derive from verbal communication, and it can influence how the message is interpreted. If the nonverbal message contradicts the verbal message, the nonverbal message is given greater credence because nonverbal messages are perceived as less conscious and therefore more honest. So let me say that again. If the nonverbal message contradicts or is different from the verbal message, people believe the nonverbal message. So, how do verbal and nonverbal messages differ? The verbal language system is based primarily on symbols, where the nonverbal system is sign-based. The sending capacity of the nonverbal code is much more restrictive than the verbal code. We have more words that we can use than symbols. Verbal codes have a formal phonetic system and syntax governing usage, whereas there are no formal rules governing the use of nonverbal code systems. So oftentimes nonverbal codes can be less precise. Knapp and Hall identified 6 primary functions of nonverbal communication. First, nonverbal communication can repeat a verbal message. So we use nonverbal codes to repeat what has been said. So for example, if you are giving directions and you point towards something, toward the direction, nonverbal communication can contradict a verbal message. So as I said already, it's generally the nonverbal message that we believe if the messages contradict. The nonverbal can substitute a verbal message. So think about if you're eating and you wave hi instead of saying hello. Complement a verbal message. So in this context, the nonverbal behavior adds information. It can accent a verbal message. Complementing and accenting are similar, but accenting is stronger in intensity. In these cases, nonverbal messages accent the emotions conveyed by verbal messages by adding more information to the expression. And then nonverbal messages can regulate verbal communication. And this is when you tell someone to do or not to do something, such as the use of head nods, arm movements, and such that control the flow of a conversation. Your textbook also talks about all the different types of nonverbal communication. I'm not going to go through all of those, but you should read that thoroughly. They talk about kinesics, proxemics, chronemics, haptics, physical appearance and dress, paralanguage, olfactics. So you need to know what all of that means. So the textbook talks about the influence of culture on nonverbal communication. So one of the major ways that intercultural communication discusses this is through this cultural dimension developed by Edward Hall, high and low context cultures. So this refers to the extent to which we gather information from the physical, social, and psychological context of an interaction, as opposed to the explicit verbal code. So when a culture is high context, You gather information from nonverbal cues, from the context from where something happened, from nonverbals. And in a low context culture, everything that you get is from the verbal message. So in high context cultures, people rely on the context to derive meaning. In low context cultures, people rely on words to create and interpret meaning. Culture and nonverbal behaviors are inseparable, as cultural rules and norms determine nonverbal meanings and usage. People hold expectancies about the appropriateness of the nonverbal behaviors of others. As nonverbal communication varies across cultures, it's important that interactants from different cultural backgrounds learn each other's expectations regarding appropriate nonverbal behaviors. Such knowledge and awareness of other cultures helps reduce uncertainty and improve the chance of success in intercultural communication encounters. Specifically, Lustig and Kester identified 3 cultural variations in nonverbal communication. And this just kind of explains how the role of culture in nonverbal communication. Cultures differ in their specific repertoire of behavior, such as body movements, gestures, postures, spatial requirements. Think about your personal space, your bubble. All cultures have display rules which govern the context and uses of various nonverbal communication. And the meaning attributed to particular nonverbal behaviors differ from culture to culture. So this chapter explains to us that there is no formal grammar governing the use of nonverbal codes. These rules are learned as part of our culture's socialization process. We learned that there are many functions of nonverbal communication, 7 major types of nonverbal communication, and that nonverbal communication is dictated by culture, it's influenced by culture, and it's important to intercultural communication.